My parents told me to eat in the garage at my sister's wedding. Then the groom handed me the microphone. There's a specific kind of humiliation that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with screaming or a scene or something you can point to and say, there, that's the moment. It comes quietly, wrapped in logistics, in a practical tone of voice. And your mother saying, very calmly, as if she's telling you about a seating chart adjustment, that it would probably be best if you ate in the garage, not the kids' table, not the back corner, the garage. Because my sister's fiance's family was traditional, and my presence, specifically my wheelchair, would make the dining room feel cramped and might upset the flow of the photos. Those are real words my mother said to me on a real Tuesday evening, 6 days before my sister's wedding. She said them sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea in her hand. And when she finished saying them, she took a sip and looked at me like she just explained a minor scheduling conflict and was waiting for me to nod and move on. I was 31 years old. I had driven 3 hours to be there for the final week of wedding prep. I had bought a dress, a real dress, not something easy or adaptive. A dress I'd spent 2 hours finding because I wanted to look nice for my sister's day. I had written the toast, a real one, with a joke in the middle that I tested on two separate friends who had both laughed in the right place. The garage. I want to walk you back before I walk you forward, because the garage doesn't make sense without the context, and the context is the kind of thing that takes years to explain and still doesn't fully explain itself. My name is Renee. I've been in a wheelchair since I was 19, a car accident, the kind that happens in under 3 seconds and rearranges everything that comes after. I was a sophomore in college, pre-med actually, which has a particular irony I've made peace with. The accident wasn't dramatic in the way people expect when they hear the word accident. No one else was seriously hurt. A patch of ice, a guardrail, and a very specific angle of impact that compressed my spine in a way that couldn't be undone. I woke up in a hospital and started learning, slowly and then all at once, what my life was going to look like going forward. My family's response to that was complicated. My parents loved me. I want to be clear about that because it's true and because what I'm about to describe doesn't cancel it out, even though it sometimes feels like it should. They loved me in the way people love something they don't know what to do with. My dad dealt with it by throwing himself into problem solving, ramps, modifications, logistics. My mother dealt with it by grieving, which is its own thing, and I understood it, except that she never quite stopped. 12 years later, she was still grieving the version of me that existed before the ice and the guardrail, still sometimes treating the person I'd actually become as a kind of placeholder for the real Renee who was apparently still out there somewhere, waiting to be recovered. My sister Jess was 24 at the time of her wedding. She's 5 years younger than me, and we were close when we were kids, in the way siblings are when there are only two of you and you've built a whole private world together. After the accident, things shifted not cruelly but noticeably. She was 17 when it happened, and I think she didn't know how to hold it. And then she went to college and built a life that was mostly separate from the weight of what our household had become. And I couldn't really blame her for that. I'd done the same thing in my own way. She met Marcus at 22 and they got engaged 2 years later, and I was genuinely, completely happy for her. Marcus was warm and funny and looked at her like she was something he couldn't believe was real. And that's all you actually want for your sister. When she asked me to be in the wedding, I said yes immediately, and I meant it. Then I met his parents, Gerald and Patricia. I'll call them that because those are their actual names, and I've stopped feeling protective of people who don't extend the same courtesy to me. They came to visit the month after the engagement, and Jess had that particular nervous energy she gets when she wants something to go well. And I noticed it, but didn't think much of it. The dinner was fine on the surface. Gerald talked a lot. Patricia smiled the way women smile when they've been taught that smiling is the appropriate response to everything. They were polite to me in the specific, uncomfortable way people are polite when they don't know where to put you, when your presence doesn't fit the template they walked in with. I told myself it was just unfamiliarity. I was good at telling myself things like that. Over the following months, as the wedding planning accelerated, I started picking up on a pattern. Jess would call me excited about something, a venue decision, a menu choice, and then 2 days later call back slightly deflated, saying, we're going in a different direction. Or Marcus's mom had some feelings about that. The reception venue they'd originally chosen had been fully accessible. The one they ended up with was in a historic building that technically met code minimums, which in practice meant I could get in the front door and access the main hall, but not the bridal suite, not the mezzanine, not the garden area where the cocktail hour would be. When I mentioned this to Jess, she said, I know, I'm sorry. Patricia had her heart set on it. I'll make sure you're taken care of. I should have paid more attention to that phrase. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Because in my experience, when people say they'll take care of you, they mean they'll take care of the situation you create. They mean they'll manage the inconvenience of your existence in the most efficient way available to them. The garage conversation happened on a Tuesday, as I said. I've been there 3 days already, helping with centerpieces and running errands and doing the things you do when your sister is getting married in less than a week. My mom came and sat across from me after dinner and said she needed to talk about the seating situation. Gerald and Patricia had expressed concern. She used the word concern like it was a health issue about the dining room layout. The round tables were close together, apparently. My chair would make it difficult for people to move around. The caterers needed space to serve. And there was the matter of the photos, the family photos especially, and Patricia had mentioned, apparently more than once, that she wanted the photos to have a consistent look. A consistent look. My mother said the garage had been cleaned out. There was a card table set up and they put a nice cloth on it. I could eat in there during dinner service and then come back out for the dancing portion. She said this like it was a reasonable accommodation, like she had problem solved on my behalf, like she was, in fact, doing me a favor. I remembered the exact sound of the room after she finished talking. The refrigerator hum. A car outside. My own breathing. I said, Mom, you want me to eat in the garage? She said, just during dinner. It's only an hour. I said, at my sister's wedding. She said, Renee, I know it's not ideal. Not ideal. Not ideal. I want you to understand that I was very calm when I said this. Dangerously calm. The kind of calm that comes not from being okay, but from the fact that somewhere underneath the calm, there was something so large and so loud that the only way to keep it contained was to go very, very still. Mom, I'm in the wedding. I'm a bridesmaid. You can still be in the ceremony. This is just the dinner portion. Patricia asked you to do this. A pause. She raised some concerns. Did Jess agree to this? Another pause. Different quality. Longer. Jess understands that the venue has limitations. That's not what I asked. My mother looked at her iced tea. She had the same tell she's always had, going back to when I was a kid and she was deciding how much of the truth to say out loud. She looks at something nearby, something neutral, and she finds a very important thing about it to examine. I pushed back from the table and went to the guest room and closed the door. I didn't call Jess that night. I thought about it for a long time, lying in bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my childhood home. And I decided I wasn't going to. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to know something first. I needed to know whether this had come from Patricia alone, or whether my sister had looked at this plan and said, yes, that works. Put her in the garage. Those are different things. They're not both forgivable in the same way. I texted Mara. I seem to have a Mara in every story, which tells you something about the kind of friends worth keeping. And I just said, something happened. I'll call you tomorrow. She sent back a single question mark, and I sent back a Raj, and she sent back a string of emojis that communicated exactly the right amount of outrage. I slept badly. In the morning, I got up and made coffee, and my mom came downstairs and moved around me in the kitchen with the careful, negotiating energy of someone who knows they've done something wrong and is hoping time will soften it before they have to address it directly. I drank my coffee and didn't help her with that. Just called me at 10. Her voice had that particular texture it gets when she's been crying and is trying to sound like she hasn't. She said, Mom told me you were upset. Not Mom told me what she said to you. Upset, like it was a mood I'd arrived in rather than a response to something that had happened. I said, Jess, did you know about the garage? Silence. It wasn't. It was presented to me as a solution, and I was so overwhelmed with everything, and I didn't think it through. I should have. Did you say yes? I said I'd talk to you about it, Jess. Did you say yes? The silence this time was the kind that answers the question without words. I heard her breathing. I could picture her exactly, sitting on her bed probably, knees pulled up, picking at the edge of her thumbnail the way she's done since she was 12 years old when she's stressed. And I felt in that moment about 6 different things simultaneously. Hurt, anger, the specific grief of watching your sibling choose someone else's comfort over your dignity, but also, and I didn't want to feel this, it complicated things. I felt sorry for her. I knew what it was like to be the person in our family who tried to keep Patricia happy while also trying to keep me comfortable. And I understood, on some cellular level, why she had buckled. She shouldn't have, but I understood why. I said, I'm not eating in the garage. She said, I know, I'm so sorry. I'm going to fix it. Jess, I promise, I'm going to fix it. Just please don't leave. That last part. Please don't leave. That last part. Please don't leave. I want you to know that it was the only reason I stayed. Not the fixing a promise, because I'd learned not to put too much weight on promises made under pressure. But the fear in her voice when she said those three words, that was real. She knew, I think, on some level, what it would mean if I left. Not just for the wedding, for us. For the thing we've been quietly trying to rebuild over the years since I was 19, and an ice patch rearranged everything. I said, I'm not going anywhere. And I meant it. I meant it completely, even knowing what I knew, even sitting on the floor of the garage metaphorically, about to get up and walk back in. The next 4 days were a particular kind of tense that I'm not sure I have the right words for. Jess made calls. I don't know exactly what was said to Patricia and Gerald, and I didn't ask because I was trying to hold myself together, and picking at that particular thread would have unraveled me. The garage plan was quietly dropped. I was reassigned to a table, not near the head table, not with the family, but at a table with two of Jess's college friends I'd met once, and a cousin of Marcus's who turned out to be perfectly nice, but wasn't who I'd expected to spend the evening with. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I'd survived worse accommodation failures than this, and I had, technically, so that was true. What I hadn't told anyone, not Jess, not my mom, not Mara, was that I still had the toast. I'd been asked in the original planning stages whether I wanted to give a toast. I'd said yes. At some point in the chaos of the venue and the seating and the garage conversation, the toast had been quietly removed from the program. Nobody told me directly. I found out by asking Jess about the reception timeline and noticing my name wasn't on it. When I asked her about it, she got that look, the thumbnail picking look, and said they'd decided to keep the speeches to the best man and maid of honor to keep things moving. And I nodded and said okay, and felt something else get added to the quiet pile of things I was carrying. So I had a toast in my phone's notes app that nobody was going to hear. And I had a dress I'd spent 2 hours finding. And I had a seat at a table near the back next to a cousin of Marcus's. And I had 4 days to figure out how to be gracious about all of it. And then, the night before the wedding, Marcus knocked on the door of the guest room. I almost didn't answer. I was tired in the specific way you get tired when you've been managing your own emotions for days on end. The kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep can fix. But I opened the door, and he was standing there in the hallway in a t-shirt and sweatpants, and he had the look of someone who had been working up to a conversation for a while. He said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I said, "Sure." He sat down on the edge of the bed, and I stayed in my chair by the door, and he looked at his hands for a second the way people do when they're about to say something that costs them something. He said, "I know what my mom asked her family to do with the garage." He looked up. "I found out yesterday, and I've been sick about it. I need you to know that was not okay with me. None of it." I looked at him. I didn't say anything right away. He said, "I also know the toast got pulled from the program." I still didn't say anything. "Do you still have it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to give it." I want to tell you what it felt like when Marcus said those words, because I think if I skip over it, I'll be lying about the story. It felt like something unlocking, something I hadn't realized was locked until I heard the click. I'd spent 12 years being managed, accommodated in the minimizing sense of the word, put somewhere out of the way, made into a logistical problem that needed solving, handed solutions that were really just better decorated versions of the garage. And here was this man who had known me for 2 years, who had watched what his mother did and gone to his room and felt sick about it, and knocked on my door the night before his wedding to make it right. Not because it benefited him, not because anyone was watching, just because he thought it was wrong and couldn't leave it alone. I said, "Your mom is going to hate this." He said, "Yeah, probably." I said, "Jess knows?" He said, "I told her an hour ago." She cried. Good crying, I think. I almost laughed at that. Almost. I was still holding a lot of things, and my face wasn't sure what to do with all of them at once. I said, "Are you sure?" He looked at me with the kind of directness that you can't fake. The kind that comes from someone who has already had the internal argument with themselves and come out the other side decided. He said, "You're her sister. You wrote a toast. You should give it." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Okay." He nodded. He got up to leave and then turned back at the door and said, "For what it's worth, I'm really glad you're going to be in our lives." And then he left, and I sat there in the dark guest room with my phone in my hand and opened my notes app and read through the toast twice, and then I cried a little bit, quietly, the way you cry when something that was clenched in you for a long time finally lets go. The wedding day itself was one of those beautiful fall days that feels like it's been ordered specifically for the occasion. The air clean and cold, the light coming in gold and low the way it does in October. I got dressed in the guest room by myself, which I'd requested, because getting ready in a group requires a kind of easy physicality that doesn't always work for me, and I didn't want to spend my emotional energy managing anyone's discomfort about that. The dress looked good. I'd been right about it. I saw Patricia at the venue before the ceremony. She was wearing a cream-colored suit, and she had the fixed, bright expression of a woman who has been anticipating this day for a long time and is determined to experience it as she planned it, which in her case meant experience it as she planned it, which in her case meant experiencing it as if I was somewhat less present than I actually was. She said hello to me with a smile that stopped well short of her eyes and then turned her attention to something happening near the floral arrangements. I smiled back. I had a toast in my pocket. I had a toast in my pocket. I could afford to be generous. The ceremony was beautiful, genuinely, fully beautiful in a way that made everything else temporarily irrelevant. Jess walked down the aisle and I saw Marcus's face when he saw her, and it was the kind of moment that resets things, that reminds you why you're there. I sat at the end of the row in the spot they'd left for my chair, and I watched my sister get married and I let myself feel all of it. The joy, the grief that lives right next to joy at moments like this. The complicated love that comes with complicated families. Jess caught my eye during the vows and held it for a second, and I knew what she was saying. I nodded. She blinked fast. We've been having whole conversations with minimal words since we were kids. The reception moved the way receptions move, cocktail hour, the chaos of getting everyone inside and seated, the first dances. I was at my table near the back, and I want to be honest, it stung a little. Not devastatingly, not in a way I couldn't manage, but in the quiet, persistent way that being placed away from the people who matter always stings. The cousin of Marcus's, whose name was David, turned out to be very good company. He was a high school history teacher with an inexhaustible supply of absurd anecdotes from his classroom, and he made me laugh genuinely at least 3 times, which I needed. But I kept watching the head table, watching my parents, watching Patricia, who was working the room with the particular energy of a woman who believes a successful wedding is largely a performance she is producing, watching Jess, who was glowing the way people glow when they've been afraid something might fall apart and it didn't, who kept glancing toward me with an expression I recognized as relief. The best man gave his speech. It was fine, the standard mix of gentle embarrassment for Marcus and heartfelt sincerity, land well, sit down. The maid of honor went next. She'd been Jess's best friend since college, and she knew Jess the way you know someone you chose, which is different from the way you know someone you grew up with. It was a good toast. It made people laugh and then made people tear up, and she sat down to applause and raised glasses. And then Marcus stood up. I assumed he was going to add something to the best man's toast the way grooms sometimes do. A quick thank you, a joke, raise a glass. He picked up the microphone and he looked out at the room and he said, I have one more thing I need to do before we eat. And then he walked away from the head table across the dance floor toward the back of the room, toward my table. I watched him coming and my heart did something complicated. People were turning to look. My mother was turning to look. Patricia. And I can tell you the exact expression on her face because I have replayed this moment many times. Patricia had gone very still in the way people go, still when something is happening that they did not schedule and cannot control. Marcus stopped at my table. He held out the microphone and he looked at me and he said, loudly enough for the room to hear, my sister-in-law was supposed to give a toast tonight. We fixed a scheduling error. Renee, the floor is yours. The room was quiet for a beat. That particular kind of quiet where everyone is recalibrating. I took the microphone. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I'd thought they would shake. I looked out at the room, at all these faces, some of whom I knew, and some of whom were strangers, at my parents sitting next to each other with expressions I couldn't fully read, at Patricia, who had rearranged her face into something neutral but couldn't quite hide the tension in her shoulders, at Jess, who was pressing her fingers to her mouth and looking at me with eyes that were already full. I said, I've been working on this for about 3 months, so I apologize in advance if it's a little over-rehearsed. A few people laughed. The energy in the room shifted, just slightly, just enough, toward me instead of away. I said, my sister and I have a 5-year age gap, which when you're kids feels like an unbridgeable distance and when you're adults turns out to be basically nothing. When Jess was 7 and I was 12, she used to follow me around the house asking me questions. Not small questions. Big ones. She wanted to know why the sky changed colors at sunset and whether fish had feelings and what I thought happened after he died. I had no idea how to answer any of these questions, but I took them seriously because she asked them seriously and because even at 7 Jess had this quality of paying complete attention, of making you feel like your answer mattered. I paused. Jess had put her hand down from her mouth and she was just watching me, open faced, the way she used to watch me when she was 7. She still does that. She pays attention in a way that's actually rare. And when I watch her with Marcus, the thing that makes me certain they're going to be okay isn't how happy they are on a good day. It's how carefully they pay attention to each other on the hard ones. It's the way he knows when she's pretending to be fine and calls it out gently. It's the way she knows what he needs before he finds the words for it. That's not chemistry. That's not luck. That's a choice they make over and over to actually see each other. I looked at Marcus. You're really good at seeing people, Marcus. I let that sit for just a second. She is very lucky. But I think you already know that. Someone at a table nearby made a sound that was half laugh, half something else. I heard my dad clear his throat. Jess. I looked at my sister. You've been asking me big questions since you were 7 years old. Here's one back. You asked the right person to spend your life with. I hope you know that. I hope on the hard days, when it feels complicated and imperfect the way real things do, you remember that you chose someone who pays attention, who shows up, who thinks the right thing and then actually does it, even when it costs him something. Marcus looked at the table. I love you enormously. I have since the day you came home from the hospital and Dad put you in my arms and I looked at you and thought, okay, here's someone I'm going to worry about for the rest of my life. I was 12 and I was right. Congratulations. Please dance badly with me later. The room laughed. Real laughter, the kind that breaks the surface tension of a moment and lets the emotion underneath come through. I held up my glass and the room held up theirs and I said, to Jess and Marcus, and 200 people set it back and I sat down and Marcus took the microphone and squeezed my shoulder once briefly before he walked away. Jess was crying. The real kind, not the held back kind. Real tears going down her face with her mascara and her not caring. She mouthed something at me from across the room. I couldn't read lips perfectly, but I was pretty sure it was, I'm sorry and thank you simultaneously, compressed into 2 words. I nodded. I looked at my glass. I took a breath. Patricia did not speak to me for the rest of the evening. She moved through the room with the practiced ease of a woman pretending a thing didn't happen, smiling at caterers and hugging distant relatives and not once moving in my direction. I watched her at one point talking to my mother near the bar, both of them with their heads slightly lowered, and I didn't try to read it. Whatever that conversation was, it wasn't mine to manage. My mother came to find me later, during the dancing. She sat down in the chair next to me that David had vacated, and she was quiet for a moment, watching the dance floor, and then she said, that was a beautiful toast. I said, thank you. She said, I should have, and then stopped, started again. I should have handled it differently, all of it. I looked at her. She was looking at the dance floor at Jess, who was dancing with Marcus in the way people dance when they're happy and tired and don't care what it looks like. I said, yeah, you should have. She nodded. She didn't try to explain it or soften it or contextualize it. She just nodded, and we sat there together watching my sister dance, and it wasn't okay. Not fully, not yet, maybe not for a while, but it was something. It was a start. My dad danced with me twice. He's not a good dancer, and he knows it, and he doesn't care, which has always been one of his best qualities. The second dance was a slow one, and he put his hands on the arms of my chair and sort of swayed awkwardly, and I laughed at him, and he grinned, and for those 3 minutes we were just a dad and his daughter. At a wedding, nothing else, and I held on to that. Jess found me right before the end of the night, when the venue was starting to empty out, and the caterers were beginning to move around the edges of the room collecting glasses. She crouched down next to my chair, not in the performative, look how I'm being inclusive way people sometimes do, just because she wanted to be at eye level. And she looked at me and she said, I'm sorry. I want to say it more specifically than I said it on the phone. I knew what they were asking, and I let it go too far, and I should have shut it down immediately, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, I'm going to do better. I said, I know that too. She put her arms around me carefully, the way she's learned over the years, and I hugged her back, and I could smell her perfume and feel her hair against my face, and for a second, she was 7 years old again, asking me about the sky. That was 8 months ago. Jess and Marcus got back from their honeymoon, and they found an apartment with an elevator and wide doorways, which Jess texted me a photo of before they'd even moved in. Marcus has called me twice just to talk, which is something my actual brother-in-law had never done in 8 years of being my brother-in-law, and I find that quietly hilarious. Patricia and I exist in the polite detente of people who will see each other at holidays and have both agreed, without explicitly saying so, to keep it very surface level. She complimented my earrings at Thanksgiving. I said, thank you. That's where we are, and I think that's where we'll stay, and I've genuinely made peace with it. My parents and I are in a different place than we were before the wedding. Better, I think, in the fragile, honest way that things sometimes get better after something breaks, and you decide to try to put it back together with clear eyes. My mom called me last month and said something I didn't expect. She said, I think I've spent a long time making your lives smaller so other people would be more comfortable. She said it like she'd been carrying it for a while and finally just put it down. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, yeah, just that. She said, I'm working on it. I believe her. I'm not sure how far working on it will take us, but I believe she means it, and that matters. Here's the thing about being put in the garage. And I mean that literally, but I also mean it as everything it stands for. Every time someone has rearranged me out of a space I had every right to be in, every accommodation that was really just a better looking form of removal, every moment someone decided the optics of my existence were more important than my presence in it. You learn after a while to fight the right battles. You learn to carry the things worth carrying and put down the ones that are just weight. You learn who shows up and who performs showing up and how to tell the difference. You learn that the people who deserve your presence are the ones who don't need to be convinced of it, who don't require you to make yourself smaller, who know the difference between a seating accommodation and a consolation prize. Marcus knew the difference. He crossed a room in front of 200 people and handed me a microphone, and I will think about that for a long time. Not because it was a grand gesture, though it was, but because of what it cost him. It cost him a version of the evening his mother had planned. It cost him a smooth, uninterrupted execution of someone else's vision. He paid that cost without flinching because he thought it was right. That's who my sister married. I think she knew what she was doing all along. The toast I gave that night is still in my notes app. I read it sometimes, not out of nostalgia exactly, but because I spent 3 months writing it for a sister I love in a family that is flawed and complicated and mine, and it turned out okay. Better than okay. It turned out exactly as it should have. Sometimes things do.